They're mocking us. The bitter whisper carried the entire weight of the Reich's defeat, but the competing smell, salt, smoke, and something almost holy told a dangerous, intoxicating lie. The first sound that morning wasn't the relentless Texas wind or the sharp cry of crows circling above the dusty plains. It was the irresistible crackle of bacon in an iron skillet. The aroma drifted through the cold morning air, salt, smoke, and the unforgettable scent of forbidden, scandalous abundance. 30 German prisoners, remnants of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ground crews, stood in a ragged, silent line beside a weathered ranch house just outside Waco, Texas. Their uniforms were faded, their heavy boots half worn through, their faces thin and pale from years of systemic rationing. They had been rigorously trained to expect only punishment, brutal, hard labor, and cold, relentless stares. Instead, they smelled breakfast. Inside the kitchen, Martha "Ma" Turner, 58 years old, her gray hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, flipped thick strips of bacon on a pan large enough to feed an entire cavalry troop. "Tell those boys to sit down," she called out, her voice calm and firm, to her son, Sergeant Frank Turner, a rancher reluctantly drafted into running POW labor crews after the war had consumed most of his farm hands. Frank stepped outside and hesitated, the barbed wire gleaming behind him. "Mama," he said softly, his voice laced with caution. "They're Germans." Ma Turner didn't even look up from the sizzling fat. "Son," she said, her tone cutting through the tension. "They're men, and men work better on a full stomach. Now move." Outside, the prisoners watched with fixed, horrified concentration as the ranchers set out the tin plates. A pitcher of fresh milk, warm, white biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth, real coffee, thick, black, and intensely steaming. Klaus Richter, a 4-year-old former Luftwaffe mechanic, stared at the sight with profound, stomach-churning disbelief. Back in the bombed-out ruins of Germany, even the most elite soldiers hadn't seen a breakfast like this since 1941. He whispered frantically to the man beside him, "This is a trick." The man nodded grimly. "They're mocking us." But then Ma Turner stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. Her voice was calm, ordinary, almost cheerfully mundane. "You all eat up before it gets cold." For a long, paralyzing moment, no one moved. The prisoners glanced anxiously at one another, their muscles tense, waiting for the inevitable cruelty that they were sure must follow. Then, one man, an older corporal with deeply trembling hands, finally picked up a biscuit and carefully tore it open. The steam rose from the soft dough like smoke from heaven. He took one bite, a desperate, silent motion, then dropped his face onto his knees, his eyes instantly flooding with tears. He wasn't crying from fear or from hunger. He was crying because he could not, for the life of him, remember what kindness felt like. One by one, the others followed. Klaus knelt too, the warm biscuit still clutched in his hands. He couldn't force himself to eat. He just stared at the simple food, his throat tight, his mind reeling. These were the very people they had been taught were monsters, Americans, soulless capitalists who would surely enslave or starve them. Yet here he was, being served by a woman who looked at him like a wary neighbor instead of a conquered enemy. Ma Turner noticed the complete silence. She walked calmly over to Klaus and gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here," she said softly, her touch surprisingly light. "Breakfast don't care what flag you served." Something vast and unbreakable finally shattered inside him. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against the cold tin plate, and whispered a desperate prayer in German. That morning, 30 men who had once fanatically fought for Hitler's Reich learned a devastating truth their generals had never told them, that America's real, enduring strength didn't come from its guns or its tanks or its colossal bombers. It came from people like Martha Turner, people whose ingrained faith and simple decency ran infinitely deeper than their hatred of the enemy. By the time the plates were quietly cleared, the camp guards stood in stunned silence. None of them had expected this. No official military orders had prepared them for the sight of captured prisoners weeping openly over bacon and biscuits. Later, one of the Texans, Corporal Mac Macmillan, would write in his diary, "They didn't fall from hunger. They fell from disbelief." And as the sun rose fully over the Texas plains, the prisoners looked up from their plates with something the war had stolen from them long ago. Hope. It was just breakfast. But it changed everything. A year before that fateful breakfast, in the burning dust of North Africa, Klaus Richter had finally surrendered. He was 24. His Luftwaffe ground crew scattered and annihilated by Allied bombs that turned the desert sky into blinding fire. The Germans had been explicitly warned what would happen if captured by Americans. "They shoot mechanics first," his sergeant had screamed. "They think we sabotage their planes." Another had added, "If they don't shoot you, they'll ship you home in a box." That was the core belief Berlin relentlessly pumped out. It was fear dressed up as loyalty, intended to make surrender fundamentally unthinkable, and for agonizing months, it worked. Klaus had clung to his wrench like a weapon, vowing to die before capture. But when the massive Allied tanks came, rolling over the sand and shrapnel like an iron tide, his will finally broke. He dropped his tools, his hands flying up. He expected the end. Instead, he got water. An American sergeant tossed him a canteen, muttering, "You look like hell, pal." Another offered a cigarette. No kicks, no shouting, just calm, businesslike gestures. It didn't make sense. Klaus kept waiting for the promised cruelty, the violence the Reich had guaranteed. But it never came. He was herded with hundreds of other prisoners, loaded onto trucks, and taken to a staging camp near Algiers. There, American medics treated their wounds. They were fed, meticulously washed, and even given fresh soap and sharp razors. A defeated German officer spat on the ground. "Propaganda," he muttered bitterly. "They're showing us mercy for the cameras." But there were no cameras, just overwhelming efficiency, rigid order, and fundamental humanity. Weeks later, they boarded a transport ship under heavy guard. Rumors spread like wildfire among the POWs. "We're being sent to England." "No, to dig graves in Italy." Then one morning, as dawn lit the cold sea, an American lieutenant stood on deck and said it plainly. "You're going to the United States." The men laughed bitterly. "Impossible," Klaus said. "They wouldn't bring enemies home." The lieutenant merely shrugged. "You'll see." For 14 long days, the Atlantic stretched endlessly before them. The food was rationed, but decent. Bread, meat, coffee. The guards did not gloat or sneer. They simply did their difficult, tedious jobs. Some even joked tentatively with the Germans, trading words in broken English and halting German. When they finally docked in New York Harbor, Klaus saw the Statue of Liberty through the thick, swirling fog. For a terrifying moment, the colossal symbol that had once been an enemy's myth became utterly real. He whispered to himself, "So this is America." The next weeks were a blur of rattling train rides and sterile processing centers. They were fingerprinted, photographed, tagged, and moved inland. And all along the way, Klaus saw something that unsettled him far more than any violence could have. Ordinary Americans going about their lives unafraid, unbroken, and surrounded by overwhelming abundance. No rubble, no shortages, no visible hunger. Children waved innocently at the trains that carried their supposed enemies westward. For the first time, Klaus began to wonder if the Reich had lied to him about more than just the progress of the war. At Camp Hearn, Texas, his primal fear returned when the gates closed behind him. The camp was clean, the guards calm, but the profound unknown loomed large. "They'll starve us slowly," a fellow prisoner whispered. "They'll make us beg." But that night, Klaus saw something through the wire. A kitchen light still burning brightly, and the silhouette of a woman setting out loaves of bread on a long table. He didn't know her name yet, but soon that woman and her breakfast would teach him more about America than any propaganda or military briefing ever could. By late 1943, the United States faced a different kind of war problem. Not a shortage of bullets, but a severe shortage of hands. Millions of American men had gone overseas, and the massive farms that fed the nation were starving for labor. Wheat rotted in the fields, cotton bales piled up, unpicked. Ranchers across the South faced financial ruin. The War Department's answer came quietly and efficiently: turn prisoners into workers. It was both eminently practical and ethically moral. The Geneva Convention allowed POW labor as long as the prisoners were treated humanely. America didn't just agree to this, It actively over-delivered. By 1944, more than 425,000 Axis POWs were held across the United States, with over 78,000 inches Texas alone. Dozens of camps sprouted across the state. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mexia, Camp Huntsville. Together, they became an invisible, sprawling network of civility and containment, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Panhandle. Each camp established its own microcosm of order: barracks, mess halls, classrooms, recreation fields, even makeshift theaters. The men were given medical care, books, sports equipment, and pay for their labor. They received 80 cents per day, paid in camp tokens, redeemable for small luxuries like tobacco or stationery. The logic was simple. A prisoner treated with basic dignity caused far fewer problems than one consumed by despair. But the POW system wasn't solely an act of generosity, it was an economic necessity. Texas agriculture had lost more than 70% of its able-bodied labor force to enlistment. The state's food production was collapsing under the vast weight of victory abroad. So, the army struck deals with local farmers and ranchers. The government would supply POW labor. Landowners would pay the official wages to the War Department, not directly to the prisoners. It was a perfect, efficient arrangement. Cheap, necessary labor for the struggling farmers, productive work for the prisoners, and undeniable proof that democracy could function effectively without cruelty. Still, not everyone was pleased. When Sergeant Frank Turner first received notice that his ranch would host a POW, a work crew, he slammed the letter angrily on the kitchen table. "I fought their kind in France 25 years ago," he exclaimed, referring to World War I. "Now you want me to feed them?" Ma Turner, his mother, wiped her hands slowly on her apron and said simply, with the finality of an ancient law, "You can't fix the world by starving men." That was precisely how it began, the strange, quiet integration of German POWs into the heart of Texas farm life. The trucks rolled in before dawn on a cool spring morning. A dozen Germans stepped off under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The ranch dogs barked fiercely, the cattle turned restless, and the locals watched from a respectful distance, whispering nervously. Klaus Richter was among them, still rail-thin from captivity, still weary and afraid. To him, the open space of the ranch felt intensely unnatural. There were no fences high enough to cage the entire sky, no shouting guards, no constant threat of gunfire, just an empty horizon. An American corporal handed Ma Turner a clipboard. "These men will help with fencing and irrigation. You'll have them back by sundown." Ma nodded, studying the thin, hesitant men. "They look hungry," she stated flatly. The corporal, Mac Macmillan, smiled weakly. "Ma'am, they all are." That night, after the prisoners were returned to their barracks, Ma stood silently by the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet, darkened fields. "They're just boys," she murmured. "Skin and bones." Frank said nothing, but his eyes softened. He'd seen too much of war's dehumanizing waste to argue with his mother. The very next morning, Ma made a simple, unilateral decision, one that broke no army rules, but shattered every standing cultural expectation. She was going to feed them. And that, in the heart of Texas, was precisely how history's most unexpected breakfast began to take shape. When Martha Turner decided to cook for the German prisoners, she didn't ask permission. She didn't even tell the patrolling guards. She simply woke hours before dawn, lit the wood stove, and began to fry bacon in a massive pan. The pungent, delicious smell of hickory smoke rolled across the fields like a warm, thick fog of temptation. At the nearby barracks, Klaus Richter stirred from sleep. The powerful aroma hit him before the bugle did. For a blissful moment, he thought he was dreaming some memory from before the war, before his entire world burned. But when he opened his eyes, he saw the same cracked ceiling, the same canvas cots, the same thin blankets, and yet the smell was terrifyingly real. Out by the ranch house, Ma moved with serene purpose. Eggs cracked into a skillet, flour dusted her apron as she quickly kneaded biscuit dough. Coffee percolated noisily in a steel pot older than most of the soldiers stationed there. The guards arrived to supervise the work detail and froze at the sight of the porch. "Ma'am," said Corporal Macmillan, his voice uncertain. "You're not supposed to feed them like this." Ma didn't look up from flipping the bacon. "I'm not feeding prisoners," she stated simply. "I'm feeding workers." Lewis hesitated, then gave a reluctant half-smile. "I don't think the manual covers bacon diplomacy." By sunrise, the Germans arrived, led by Frank Turner and 2 guards. They carried their tools, shovels, hammers, axes, but stopped dead when they saw the table. Tin plates, real, steaming food, golden light of morning bathing the scene. No one spoke. Klaus looked from the table to the guards, waiting anxiously for the catch. In the Luftwaffe, every kindness came with a hidden blade behind it. But here, no orders barked, no jeers, no tests of obedience. Ma stepped out onto the porch and wiped her hands on a towel. "Go on now," she said, her voice warm. "It'll get cold." The prisoners hesitated. One muttered, "It's against their rules." Ma raised an eyebrow, a clear sign of maternal authority. "Then let's call it breakfast, not politics." The first man moved, an older soldier with sunken cheeks and intensely trembling hands. He sat, lifted a biscuit, and took a bite. Tears filled his eyes instantly. The rest followed, still cautious, still half expecting it to be some cruel, elaborate joke. But the food was real, the coffee was real, the kindness was real. Frank Collins watched quietly from the fence line. He'd been prepared to bitterly resent them, to see his enemy across that table. But when he saw how they ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid the food would vanish, something irreversible shifted inside him. They weren't enemies anymore. They were simply men, badly broken by the same war that had stolen so many lives on both sides. Klaus looked up at Ma and said softly in halting English, "Why? Why do this?" She smiled, the kind of tired, gentle smile of someone who's seen far too much of the world to hate anymore. "Because I can," she said simply, "and because someone ought to." Corporal Macmillan jotted a nervous note in his field book that morning. "Mrs. Collins fed the POWs again. No incident." One man cried over a biscuit. He didn't write the rest. How he himself felt a sudden lump in his throat watching it happen. How the smell of bacon mingled with something entirely new in the air, the slow, quiet collapse of hate. That breakfast didn't change the outcome of the war, but it fundamentally changed the people standing in that patch of Texas dirt. For the first time, the line between enemy and neighbor began to blur, not through speeches or formal surrender, but through the simple, overwhelming power of food and faith. And in a time when the world was desperately starving for mercy, one woman had served it hot. By the 3rd week of work, the ranch had become a strange, functional kind of family. The German POWs no longer flinched at every command, and the Texans no longer looked at them like ghosts summoned from the battlefield. Work had quietly replaced suspicion. Sergeant Frank Turner learned that Klaus Richter could fix almost anything with moving parts. He had once been a specialized aircraft mechanic, but on the ranch, he mended fences, repaired irrigation pumps, and even tuned the old tractor that hadn't run right since 1938. "You could have made a fine ranch hand," Frank told him once, half joking. Klaus had smiled. "If I'd been born here, maybe I would be." It was strange the way the war's sharp, ideological edges dulled beneath the constant Texas sun. The guards maintained their watch, but even they began to relax. There was genuinely nowhere to run. Beyond the barbed wire were miles of open range and dust. Freedom wasn't a fence to climb. It was a horizon you literally couldn't reach. Then came the day the cattle broke through the south fence. A fierce storm had rolled in the night before, whipping the range into chaos. When the morning came, a large section of wire lay torn, and 30 head of valuable cattle had wandered loose toward the dry creek bed. The guards scrambled, shouting frantic orders. Frank quickly saddled his horse, but it was too much for 3 men. "Let us help," Klaus said, stepping forward, his eyes focused. The guards hesitated, rifles half raised. "You're not authorized," one said rigidly. Frank looked at them, then at the cattle rapidly disappearing in the distance. "Authorization won't catch those steers," he snapped. "Let them ride." And so, for the very first time, German POWs mounted Texas horses. They rode hard and clumsily at first, still learning the delicate balance between fear and freedom. But within minutes, old professional instinct took over. Klaus gripped the reins like he'd gripped a control stick, firm, focused, fluid. Dust kicked up around them as they moved in formation, guiding the herd back toward the fence line. Frank watched from the ridge, a wide, unexpected grin spreading across his face. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "They ride better than half the ranch hands I've hired." When the last steer was penned, the men dismounted, panting and covered in sweat. Klaus looked at Frank and laughed, a full, unguarded sound of joy that surprised even himself. It was the first sound of true joy he'd made since before the war. That evening, Ma brought out cold lemonade and cornbread. The men, Texan and German alike, sat together on the steps of the barn, passing the cups and trading simple, honest words. "Danke." "Thank you." "Good ride." "Gut Arbeit." The guards didn't interfere. They just stood by the fence, their rifles slung casually, watching something they couldn't quite name. Later, under the fading orange of sunset, one of the guards said quietly, "You know, my brother's fighting over there somewhere near Berlin. Feels strange sitting here like this." Frank nodded. "Yeah," he said. "But if he's lucky, maybe some German farmers treating him the same way." That night in his diary, Klaus wrote a single line. "Today I rode a horse in America." The guard smiled. I smiled back. Maybe that's how peace begins. The next morning, things returned to routine. Roll call, work, rations. But the air was entirely different. The camp wasn't just a prison anymore. It had become a strange, temporary sanctuary where enemies worked side by side, bound by dust, sweat, and the simple rhythm of labor. It was the kind of quiet miracle that never made it into the newspapers, but on that Texas ranch, it meant everything. It was mid-June, the kind of morning when the Texas sky looks too vast and empty for the small earth beneath it. The air shimmered with heat even before sunrise, and Martha Turner had been awake since 4 a.m. She'd packed bread, apples, and coffee for the ranch hands. But this time, she added something more, something special. Bacon. She moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake Frank, and placed each slice into the old cast-iron skillet. The sizzle filled the house sharp and savory. The intoxicating smell drifted out the window, curling toward the P.O. quarters across the field. Inside the barracks, Klaus Richter lay awake. He had learned the rigid rhythm of the camp, the clang of morning roll call, the scrape of boots on dirt. But this was different. The smell wasn't the usual thin porridge or black coffee. It was thick and sweet, rich with fat and smoke. Bacon. He sat up, utterly confused. Bacon was something he hadn't smelled since before Stalingrad, before hunger became the only constant in his life. Out in the yard, Corporal Macmillan was already assembling the work crew. "Collins Ranch today," he called. "We're fixing fence posts." He paused, sniffing the air. "And I'll be damned," he muttered. "Mrs. Collins is cooking again." When the truck rumbled up the dirt road, the prisoners climbed in, silent and stiff. The guards rode alongside, rifles slung low. But when they reached the ranch, the tension broke instantly. Ma was waiting on the porch, her apron already dusted with flour. "Morning, boys," she said. "You've worked hard this week." "Sit for breakfast." The guards hesitated. "Ma'am," one whispered, "this isn't regulation." Ma looked him dead in the eye. "Neither is kindness." She motioned toward the table. Long planks of rough pine laid with tin plates and steaming pans of scrambled eggs, biscuits, and bacon. The German stood frozen. None dared move first. Klaus stared at the food, his stomach twisting with equal parts hunger and disbelief. "This cannot be for us," he whispered in German. But Ma nodded to him. "Yes, for you. You earned it." Slowly, they sat. The first bite came hesitantly, a small piece of biscuit dipped in coffee. Then one man took a strip of bacon. His hands trembled so badly it snapped in half before he could lift it to his mouth. He looked at it as though holding a relic. When he finally took a bite, his broad shoulders began to shake. He wasn't choking, he was crying. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks as the others followed. Each one fought back an overwhelming emotion that had been locked away behind pride, fear, and war. Klaus took his turn, biting into the bacon. It was crisp, smoky, salty, perfect. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he tasted home. Not German home, not American home, just humanity. Ma moved down the line, refilling coffee cups, expertly pretending not to notice the tears. "Eat slow," she said softly. "No one's taking it away." Even Frank, who had spent months resenting their presence, felt his throat tighten. He turned away to hide it, pretending to check the fence line. After the meal, one of the younger Germans, barely 20, stood, saluted awkwardly, and said in broken English, "Madam, you make us remember. We are men again." Ma smiled faintly. "You always were," she said. That morning became legend in the camp. Word spread fast about the ranchwoman who fed her prisoners like family, about the breakfast that broke more hearts than any battle ever could. And though no one wrote it in official reports, every man there knew it to be true. In a war built on hate, one morning of mercy was enough to remind them all why peace was worth fighting for. By December 1944, the Texas plains had cooled under pale winter skies. Frost sparkled on the barbed wire each morning, and the prisoners wrapped their government-issue blankets tighter around their shoulders. Christmas meant little to them now. The war still raged in Europe, and no letters had come from home in months. Klaus Richter had almost forgotten what celebration felt like. But on Christmas Eve, something changed at Camp Hearn. The guards moved differently, more relaxed, even smiling. A rumor rippled through the barracks. The ranchers are coming. At dusk, a convoy of pickup trucks arrived from town. On the back of one, barrels of rich stew and crates of cornbread. Another carried boxes boldly labeled Coca-Cola. The guards opened the gates halfway, not for a mass release, but for a strange, joint gathering. Frank and Ma climbed down from their truck. Ma wore her Sunday dress, the same one she'd worn since before rationing began. She carried a heavy basket of pies. Frank tipped his hat toward the Germans. "Evening, fellas," he said. "Heard you all been working hard." The men stood at attention, uncertain whether to salute or bow. One of them whispered, "What is this?" "It's Christmas," Frank replied. "And out here, we don't eat alone." Tables were dragged from the mess hall and lined in rows beneath hanging lanterns. The POWs watched as Texans and guards unpacked steaming pots of chili, biscuits, roasted vegetables, and real meat ham and beef stew that filled the air with warmth. The camp chaplain said a short prayer, both in English and German. "For those who fight, for those who wait, and for those who have fallen, may we all see peace again." Then Ma began serving. Klaus sat beside Corporal Macmillan, who passed him a small, cold bottle of Coca-Cola. "Ever had one?" the corporal asked. Klaus shook his head. He opened it carefully, and the sharp hiss of carbonation startled him. He took a sip, and his eyes widened. "It tastes like nothing from this earth," he said half to himself. Macmillan chuckled. "Yeah, that's what freedom tastes like." Laughter broke out along the tables, tentative at first, then genuine. The Germans, who had been trained to distrust any sign of mercy, found themselves relaxing. One man pulled out a harmonica. Another began humming Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The tune carried softly through the camp until a few Texans joined in with the English words. 2 languages, 1 shared melody. As the night deepened, Frank stood and raised a glass. "You boys will go home one day," he said. "But while you're here, remember you're human before you're soldiers." Klaus lifted his Coca-Cola bottle in silent salute. For a moment, the war didn't exist. The boundaries blurred. The Germans laughed at the Texans' attempts to pronounce their names. The guards forgot to glare. Ma watched it all from the edge of the firelight, her heart full and heavy at once. After the feast, as the lanterns dimmed, Klaus lingered behind to help clean up. Ma handed him a piece of leftover pie. "Merry Christmas, Klaus," she said gently. He hesitated before replying. "In Germany," he said, his voice low, "we were told Americans were soulless, but tonight I saw souls everywhere." Ma didn't answer. She just smiled and patted his arm. "Good night, son." That Christmas Eve became one of those quiet stories history almost forgot, one of food, warmth and grace shared between enemies in a world gone mad. Long after the war, veterans from both sides would tell the tale of the night when German prisoners and Texas ranchers sang Silent Night under the same stars. And those who heard it would always pause, realizing that maybe the smallest mercies in war were the biggest victories of all. After Christmas, the days stretched long and quiet. The war was turning decisively against Germany, but in the Texas winter, time seemed frozen. The POWs still worked the ranches, repairing fences, tending crops, and mending machines. Yet something profound had changed since that night of shared songs and Coca-Cola. The prisoners had stopped feeling like ghosts. Frank Turner noticed it first. Klaus no longer needed explicit orders. He simply did the job before anyone asked. He could fix a pump, mend a plow, or saddle a horse with quiet, professional precision. Even the guards, once rigid and alert, had started to trust the men they watched. One morning, Frank tossed Klaus a pair of worn leather gloves. "You ride fence with me today," he said. Klaus blinked. "Without guard?" Frank shrugged. "You earned it." The two men rode out across the open prairie, just them and the wind. Klaus couldn't help but glance constantly over his shoulder. No truck, no rifle, no shouted command, just a horizon stretching farther than he could imagine. "You know," Frank said as they rode, "these horses don't care where a man's from. You treat them right, they'll carry you anywhere." Klaus smiled faintly. Maybe people should be more like horses. They rode for hours, repairing wire and posts. At noon, they stopped under a mesquite tree, sharing a tin of beans and coffee from Frank's thermos. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. Finally, Klaus spoke. "I was an engineer," he said quietly. "Before the war, I built engines for Lufthansa. I thought I was building a future for my country. Then the war took everything, my work, my home, my name." Frank nodded, poking the dirt with a stick. "Yeah, war does that. Takes what men build and makes them rebuild it again." "Different." Klaus looked up. "You sound like you've seen too much of it." Frank didn't answer right away. "My brother's in Europe," he said finally. "Last I heard, he was somewhere near Bastogne." The air went still. Both men knew that meant the brutal battle of the Bulge. Klaus looked down, ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said. Frank stared at him, surprised. "You didn't do it. That was the war. You and me, just men who got caught in the middle of something too big." They rode home in silence. But that single exchange, simple, unadorned, carried more moral weight than any treaty. Back at the camp, the guards watched as Frank let Klaus unsaddle his horse himself. "That's a first," one muttered. Frank just said, "He's earned that too." That night, Klaus wrote in his diary, "Today, I rode without fear. No fence could hold me. No order confined me. I worked not as a prisoner, but as a man. If freedom has a sound, it is the wind in the Texas grass." Within weeks, other POWs began receiving similar freedoms. They worked with ranchers unsupervised, fixing barns and tending livestock. The army called it trust labor. The locals called it something else, neighborly. The camp became a living contradiction, a prison where men slowly rediscovered dignity. One guard remarked, "Hell, they'll go back to Germany knowing more about Texas ranching than most Texans do." Another replied, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the best revenge is teaching them how to live better." By spring, the Germans had built windmills, repaired irrigation lines, and helped restore barns destroyed by storms. They worked as if rebuilding themselves. And when the sun set each evening, the faint sound of German hymns drifted from the barracks, songs, not of conquest or victory, but of gratitude. The gift of work, freely given and shared, had become their redemption. It was ironic. Klaus thought that he had to lose his country to finally remember what being human meant. Spring came early to Texas in 1945. The blue bonnets painted the fields, and for the first time in years, the world felt intensely alive again. Inside, the POW camp, a new, vital rule had been posted. Prisoners were now allowed to send one letter home every 2 weeks. It was a small privilege, but for men who had lived in total silence, It felt monumental. Klaus Richter sat at the wooden table in the recreation hut, pen trembling in his hand. Around him, other prisoners hunched over their sheets of paper, murmuring softly, struggling to find words that could cross oceans and years of war. He wrote the date, April 2nd, 1945, and paused. What could he possibly tell his wife, Elsa? That he was alive, yes, but more than that, that he had found something he didn't know still existed. Kindness. He began slowly, each line a quiet confession. My dearest Elsa, I am writing to you from a place called Texas. I never imagined I would see such a place so vast, so empty, yet full of life. The people here are unlike any I have known. They do not hate us, even though they should. They feed us as they feed themselves. They call us by our names. They trust us with their tools, their horses, their land. He stopped for a moment, watching a dust devil spin lazily outside the window, then continued, I have learned that the strength of this country is not in its weapons, but in its people. They believe in work, in fairness, in helping even their enemies. I helped mend fences today, and the farmer thanked me. When I told him I was once an engineer, he laughed and said, Guess you still are. I think that was the first time I smiled without shame in years. Across the hut, another man was quietly crying as he wrote. Corporal Macmillan, the guard, noticed but didn't intervene. He knew what those letters meant. Klaus dipped his pen again. At home, we were told the Americans were monsters, soulless men who lived for greed and violence. But here, I see them share bread with prisoners. I see them laugh with us. One woman brought us pie last week. She said her son died in France, but she couldn't hate us for it. She said, hate won't bring him home. How can I answer such mercy? His eyes blurred as he wrote the last lines. When this war ends, I will return to you. I will bring stories, not of victory or defeat, but of humanity. Tell our children that I learned more about honor here than I ever did in uniform. With all my love, Klaus. He folded the letter carefully, sealing it with the official POW, a camp stamp. Outside, the mail truck idled near the gate. The prisoners lined up, letters clutched in their hands. For a moment, they didn't look like soldiers or captives, just men sending pieces of their hearts across the ocean. When Klaus handed his letter to Macmillan, the corporal glanced at him. Tell her you're eating better than I am, he joked. Klaus smiled softly. Better than I deserve. Weeks later, Elsa Richter received that letter in a war-torn village outside Hamburg. She read it aloud to her neighbors, who listened in stunned silence. Many wept, not from grief, but from disbelief. How could the enemy show such mercy? That letter spread from family to family, whispered from home to home. For those who had lost everything, it was the first hint that the world might still hold kindness. And though Klaus didn't know it then, his simple letter would become part of a quiet post-war revolution, proof that even in a time built on destruction, compassion could travel farther than hate ever could. By the time summer dawned in 1945, the war in Europe was over. News of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the Texas camp before sunrise. The guards turned down the radios, unsure what to say. Some of the German prisoners cheered, others fell to their knees, weeping in relief and disbelief. Klaus Richter stood silent at the fence, staring out across the glowing fields. The war that had consumed his youth was finally over. That morning, the Texans decided on something simple, something human. They would serve breakfast, not rations, not canned beans, but a meal worthy of peace. The mess hall doors opened just after sunrise. The smell of frying bacon drifted out, rich and unreal. Pancakes sizzled on griddles, and the coffee brewed thick and dark. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. They're cooking real food. The prisoners filed in, unsure if it was a mistake, a trick, or a celebration. Then they saw it. Platters piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and syrup. Not the thin oatmeal of ration days. Not the grey bread that crumbled in your hands. This was abundance. Sergeant Frank Turner stood at the serving line, sleeves rolled up, spatula in hand. "Morning, boys," he said with a wide grin. Figured peace was worth a hot breakfast. Klaus froze in place, staring at the plate in front of him. Steam rose from the food. golden in the morning light. His throat tightened. He couldn't move. When the guard beside him nudged his shoulder, Klaus whispered, "You're giving this to us?" Frank laughed softly. "Hell, you helped mend my barn. You've earned it." Klaus sat at the long wooden table, hands trembling around the fork. Across from him, another prisoner bowed his head, muttering a prayer. When Klaus finally took a bite, the salt and smoke hit his tongue like memory, like his mother's kitchen before the war, before propaganda, before everything broke. Tears filled his eyes. He tried to speak but couldn't. Around him, others wept silently, overcome not by the taste, but by the devastating realization. They had survived, and the men feeding them had never treated them as less than human. Corporal Macmillan watched from the doorway. He'd seen war up close, Normandy, street low, the faces of the dying. But this quiet morning in Texas, he thought, might be the first true victory he'd ever witnessed. Later that day, the camp commander addressed the POWs. "You'll be going home soon," he said. "Remember this country as it truly is, not perfect, but free. You came here as soldiers. You leave as men." Klaus nodded, tears still drying on his cheeks. He looked around the room at the guards who had become friends, at the Texans who had treated enemies like neighbors, and he finally understood. America's power wasn't just in its factories or its weapons or its victory. It was in mornings like this, ordinary, generous, unafraid of mercy. When he boarded the train weeks later, Klaus carried with him one small piece of that breakfast, a folded napkin tucked into his pocket. Inside, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Good luck, friend Frank." Years later, back in a rebuilt Germany, Klaus would tell his children the story not of battles or defeat, but of bacon and kindness in a Texas camp. "That," he said, "was the morning I stopped being a prisoner." And when he grew old, long after history forgot the numbers and headlines, that breakfast remained the moment that defined his life. A meal that proved even in war, the smallest act of humanity can echo louder than any victory parade. The last line of his memoir read, "They fed us not as enemies, but as men." And that morning, America's kindness filled the world,